I want to start off this morning by asking a question. And actually, I'm kind of targeting this question towards a specific group of people. I want to ask a question for those of you in this room who either are currently married or have been married. Cool? So not all of you, but most of you. And the question is kind of a difficult one to answer, so it may take a little bit of a moment for you to think about it, but the question is this: what is something that's important to you now that wasn't important to you before you got married? What's something in your life that is important to you right now that maybe you didn't consider all that important before you got married? We could even expand this question to ask what's something that was important to you before you got married that now, maybe important is kind of a strong word, but there are certain things throughout our lives that we consider to be something that is important to us, even if we don't use that particular strong language for that thing. But oftentimes, we have a tendency, whenever we invite a whole other person to come and live with us, those things that are important to us kind of shift and change. Maybe it's something as simple as a weekly television program that's just part of your routine, that's something that you just always do. But now you've gotten married and maybe you don't see that program as much, or maybe you didn't care about that program in particular. Now you're married, your spouse really likes that one, so you watch it too. Maybe it's about something that you never really gave much consideration to, like making sure you put your dishes directly in the dishwasher when you're done, instead of just leaving them in the sink to soak for days. Yeah. These are things that sort of happen as you get married, that things kind of shift and change. You'll willingly make these changes for this person because you care about them, because you love them. We'll do this sort of thing in all sorts of different things. And it's difficult to pinpoint one particular thing, I think. Especially if you've been married for, let's say, 5 years or more. Because at first it was a big adjustment for you to make. You had to consciously make this choice that I'm going to make this adjustment for this particular person. But now, 15, 20, 30, 75 years in, it just doesn't mean as much anymore. It's just part of who you are. It's part of the fabric of your life, so you don't think about it. And if you're like me, once I make a change of some kind and that change is taken set, I don't think about that change anymore. I just kind of do it, right? For an example, let me give you an example of changing a part of your routine and habits here. This is not a very serious example. But Mandy, when she and I first got married, Mandy had to make an adjustment as to what was important to her around football season. See, my wife had never really been much of a sports fan. She went to a couple of high school football games, but the way that she put it, she always hung around the marching band kids because they were cooler, and we really were perfect for each other. But she made this adjustment whenever we got married because she knew that football was important to her husband. Football, in particular, the greatest team and franchise in all of the history of football, the San Francisco 49ers. I'm red and gold till I'm dead and cold. So she knew that football was something that was important to me. And she knew that when football season came around, that every Sunday, Monday night, and Thursday night, football was going to be on our TV. That's just how it is. And so she had a choice to make. She could make the decision to ignore football altogether and just busy herself during those hours that I would be watching football. She could kind of just sit there and space out and just kind of roll her eyes at the maniac who occasionally screams at the television. I don't know who she was talking about when she said that. Or she could make the adjustment because football is important to her husband, to make football important to her as well. And because my wife is amazing and the best wife ever, I will not be taking arguments, she chose to make football something that was important to her as well. She would sit there while we were watching games and she would ask me questions about it. She'd ask me like, hey, why do they call a penalty on that? Or why is that guy upset at the end of the play? She did learn really quickly, don't ask me those questions while the 49ers are playing. But during the other games, she would ask these sorts of things to try to get an understanding of the game. She wasn't asking just to kind of humor me. She was asking because she was genuinely trying to get involved. She wanted to be as interested in football as I am, to make football as important to her as it is to me because she loves me and she cares about me. I'll never, ever forget the day where it kind of clicked to me that that's exactly what had happened, because I was just oblivious to it. I thought my wife was just asking me questions because it was on TV, so she just asked. But one day in particular, and I will never, ever, ever forget this day, she and I were sitting there, we're watching the 49ers blow it again because it was a really rough season. It was the season just before we got Jim Harbaugh as our head coach, and we had Jim Tomsula, who I'm curious to know if he'd ever actually seen football before he was asked to be the head coach of the 49ers. But we're watching them blow this particular game, and at one particular moment, all of a sudden, without any prompting whatsoever, my beautiful, my amazing wife shoots up out of her chair and yells, "That's a false start! Throw the flag!" Then they threw the flag, and my wife said, "Thank you! About time you opened up your eyes." She turned around, she sat back down with that huff. And then she noticed that her husband, who's sitting over in his recliner, is just kind of staring at her. She says, "What? These refs are horrible." It was like I'd fallen in love all over again. There are so many other ways and examples that I could point to about how Mandy and I both have shifted throughout our marriage and what's important to us. We've changed our priorities. And we have a tendency to do that in our own relationships, that if you have a friend or a spouse or somebody who's significant to you in your life, you will oftentimes make shifts to what's important to you for their sake. Sometimes these shifts are really small and insignificant and we don't really notice them. We just make that change without having to give it a moment's notice. But sometimes those shifts are huge. They are life-changing. They're complete and utter adjustments to our routine, but we willingly make these changes for these people that are important to us because we love them, because we care about them, and because we want to demonstrate that to them. That this is how much I love you, this is how much I care about you. And so in light of what we discussed last week, if we are going to be disciples of Jesus, if we're going to be more than just believers, more than just followers, but actual disciples of Jesus, then it likely means that we need to make some shifts and changes and adjustments in our priorities to be more in line with His. See, because again, like we talked about last week, in a discipleship relationship, whatever was important to the teacher or to the rabbi would make itself important to their student. That as their disciple, they would shift their own priorities in order to be more in line with what was important to their rabbi. It was a natural thing. Sometimes it took a lot of effort and it took a lot of work. And so if we are going to be disciples of Jesus, which is a relationship that I sincerely hope that you want to have, then it likely means that we got to make some shifts and some adjustments in our own priorities. That we need to reprioritize ourselves. Because I don't think it's too big of a stretch for us to be able to look at the priorities of Jesus and the priorities of us and see that there's some differences there. And I don't think Jesus is going to be the one to shift towards us. So as His disciples, as those who want to come and follow after Him to give Him everything that we've got, we have got to look at the priorities of Jesus compared to our priorities, and we got to decide to make a shift. And if there's one particular priority for us to get started here, one of the most things that we need to look at, we have to look at the things that are in line with Jesus. But one of the most glaring ones is the church's emphasis on legalism. See, here's the thing. Whether you are aware of this or not, and I sincerely hope that you are aware of it, far too often we as a church, we are far better known for what we're against. We've gotten really good at shouting at the world around us as to all the things that they're doing that they shouldn't do. And understand, we certainly have scriptural basis and foundation established within the law of Scripture as to why we believe this certain thing. But when we look at the life of Jesus, when we see this sort of thing, the law was important to Jesus, absolutely it was, but there is something that he considers to be a higher priority. See, that's the thing, is that oftentimes when it comes to priorities, it's more about what's more important than others. And for Jesus, there was a higher priority for us to follow after, one that he demonstrated to us on more than one occasion. And one of the most notable instances where Jesus demonstrated this priorital shift comes in our text today. We're going to be in John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. And this is likely a narrative that you are familiar with, that you've heard before. I know for a fact that we have actually discussed this narrative at least one occasion that I could recall. But I think it's one that we need to revisit. I think it's one that we need to talk about again, because there's something that happens in the midst of this narrative that shows us Jesus' priority. As we're talking about shifting our priorities to be more in line with his, this is one that we need to re-examine. Because through this narrative, Jesus shows us a different perspective on his priorities. In John chapter 8, verse 2, we are thrust into a unique situation almost immediately. Because in verse 2, John mentions something that I think is one of those moments that's easy for us to overlook. And while this particular verse isn't going to have a huge impact on everything else that we're going to be talking about, I do think that it does give us some indication of the priorities of Jesus. I do think that John mentions something. He phrases verse 2 in such a way that it shows us a little bit about Jesus' priority. See if you notice what I'm talking about as we read verse 2. It says, at dawn, he went to the temple, him being Jesus, and all the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach them. Did you pick up on it? Notice that John does not start off with that Jesus went to the temple to teach. He doesn't say that Jesus went to the temple with the intention of sitting down with a whole group of people to teach. We almost get this picture that Jesus, as he comes into the temple, all of a sudden, all these people who know who he is, who at least have heard enough about Jesus to recognize him when they see him, they start coming to him. And Jesus doesn't send them on their way. He doesn't say hi and go on about his business. Jesus sees these people coming to him and says, okay. They're coming to him hungry. They're ready to hear a word from him, and Jesus is not going to let them go home empty-handed. He doesn't necessarily go to the temple to teach, but he winds up teaching anyway, because these people need this. While Jesus is in the midst of this impromptu lesson, here comes what might be the biggest distraction possible. Because in verse 3 we read, then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. I sincerely don't think that this is an everyday occurrence within the temple, right? As a speaker myself, I constantly have to think about what could possibly be distracting. Oftentimes for ministers and stuff, it may be something simple like a baby crying, which if you have babies or know people who have babies, please know I don't consider that to be a distraction. I love the sound of babies crying at church because it means that we care about our next generation. So please, bring them. But this is a distraction that's on a whole other level. I think maybe the only thing that could be more distracting in this particular moment is if a guy in full clown garb were to sneak up behind Crescinda and throw a pie in her face. He missed his cue. All right. But no, Jesus is in the middle of teaching this group of people, and the Pharisees and the scribes have found this woman caught in the act of committing adultery. They drag her out into the public square, into the temple, the house of God himself, and they place her right in the middle so that everyone present can see her. This is without a doubt, hands down, no contest, the most embarrassing moment of this woman's life. You can almost picture her holding her head down, hoping that her hair is just long enough to hide her face. She's doing everything that she can to keep those eyeballs locked in on her feet with the fear of looking up because she might make eye contact with somebody she knows. A friend, a neighbor, a relative, her husband. This wave of shame and emotion has hit over her. And as she stands there in the full weight of that shame, the Pharisees and the other religious leaders, they stand in their accusations of her. In verse 4 we read it. It says, "Teacher," they said to him, "this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" Now understand, verse 6, it gives us the indication as to what their motivation is for doing this particular thing. But regardless as to what their motivation is, their rationale, well, it's dead on. See, just like every other nation before it and since it, the nation of Israel had a list of laws. And what makes the nation of Israel's laws a little bit different from everybody else's is that Israel's laws were designed by God himself and written down by Moses. Moses wrote these laws as they're getting ready, still wandering in the desert, waiting for their chance to enter into the promised land. And one of those laws that he wrote in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10 says, if a man commits adultery with a married woman, if he commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. He reinforced this particular law in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, writing, if a man is discovered having sexual relations with another man's wife, both the man who had sex with the woman and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. Moses is so sincere in getting rid of the adulterer and the adulteress. He describes it as purging an evil from their nation. By the letter of the law, this woman who is standing in front of the entire town is to be put to death. Understand, the Pharisees, they may have had terrible motivations as to why they're accusing this woman of this particular thing, but they're not wrong. Make absolutely no mistake, she needs to be executed according to the law. This is something that Moses didn't really leave a lot of wiggle room whenever he poured over this particular law for the nation of Israel. And I'll go out on a limb. And I'll make an assumption. This woman likely knew that what she was doing was against the law. This would have been something that was taught to her in the temple from the time that she was a small child. She would have heard other teachers of the law explain over and over again how adultery is a sin punishable by death. She likely would have had this reinforced in her own home, hearing it from her own parents. This is the law of the land. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew that it was a sin, and she knew the consequences of this. And I'll remind you, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. These Pharisees, they loves them the law. They love every part of it. They did everything in their own lives to try to follow the letter of the law to a T. And so when they make threats that they're going to kill her, you know they're serious. This woman, as she is standing there, she knows she has been found doing something that is going to end up resulting in her death. Because that's what the law says. So it becomes even more interesting to examine the process of Jesus in the midst of this. He doesn't fly off the handle at their rudeness of interrupting his lesson as he's trying to instruct these people. They've just broken that concentration of that group. And there's sometimes whenever, as a speaker, I face distractions and stuff like that, like a blinking TV, where the immediate thought is, well, let's just do the ending prayer because I'm never getting them back. Right? Okay, if a blinking TV makes me feel that, then I'm not a very good speaker. But this lesson that Jesus was giving these people before these Pharisees marched in, this woman caught in the act of adultery, stood her in the center of the place, and told everybody exactly what she did, that lesson's done. There's no recovering. There's no chance that Jesus can transition this back into what he was talking about. So Jesus doesn't fly off the cuff at their rudeness at this. He doesn't rebuke them for their insensitivity towards dragging her out into the public square and putting her on display, likely in a state of undress. Again, she's caught in the act. It seems at first he doesn't do anything. Like literally, he doesn't seem to do anything. The dude just stoops down and starts writing in the dirt. What a weird reaction, right? If you ask me a question and I just stoop down and start doodling in the sand, that's going to be considered kind of rude, isn't it? And so it's understandable. They keep repeating this question. What are we going to do about it? What do you say we need to do? The law says this. Jesus, what do you say? When they finally hound him to the point that he has to respond, Jesus says something that comes across, I love this, it comes across so casual. But it is filled with nuance. It is filled with substance. Because in the second half of verse 7, Jesus says, the one without sin among you should be the first one to throw a stone at her. Understand in saying this that Jesus has kind of thrown down the gauntlet for these guys. He's made a challenge to them. He's told them that if we're going to hold her accountable to the point of seeing out her punishment according to the law, and that better mean that every single one of you are following the law to a T. That there's no chance that you have broken the law of God. If you're going to be the one who's going to stand and accuse her of breaking the law, let's make sure you don't have a broken law yourself. And we know what happens next. It's one of the more cool moments, I think, in Scripture. Because it's clear that all of these men have not lived up to the letter of the law themselves. Because each one of them, after Jesus says this, starting with the oldest, which I find interesting as well, drop their stones and walk away. It's interesting to see the self-policing here, right? Because any one of them could have been a little less than honest and thrown a rock. And yet they've recognized that Jesus has hit the nail on the head, that while they love the law, while they study the law, while they are intense about the law, every single one of them has broken the law. That even though the law is so important to them that they make it their top priority, that each and every one of them are still guilty of breaking that law. I try to imagine myself, at least try to picture what that woman thinks about in that moment. As she's hearing rocks drop to the floor. Maybe that's the moment that she decides to glance up. Maybe that's the moment that she chooses, you know what, I'm gonna risk lifting my head up. And she sees these guys who were ready to kill her just a moment ago walking away from her. Finally, after a moment, Jesus stops writing in the dirt. I love that he goes back to it. That's pretty great, right? He doesn't even look to see what their reaction is. He just, I'm going back to drawing or writing or whatever it is he's doing. He looks up and he sees that nobody else is there, and he asks the woman, it's just him and her. He says, hey, is nobody going to accuse you? Nobody going to condemn you? I need you to understand something, though. I need you to get this. Like, this woman's not out of the woods yet. Right? The fact that these guys have dropped their rocks and left does not mean that she's all of a sudden no longer a lawbreaker, correct? She still broke the law, right? And even though these guys with their rocks have all left, Jesus is still here. She's not out of the woods because Jesus would still be within his legal right to be the one to kill her. He could have done that. He could have simply ended her life and it would not have been wrong according to the law of Moses. You and I would likely have a moral issue with that. But according to the law, Jesus would still be in the right. I know I've made this observation when we talked about this text before. I know I have. But I can't understate how Jesus would still be in the right if in this moment he prioritized the law and carried it out to its extent. But that's not what he does. Because he looks at her. He says, is anybody here left to condemn you? She says, no. Jesus answers her. Jesus tells her in the second part of verse 11, neither do I condemn you. Based on Jesus' own structure of how it's going to take for anybody to be able to throw that first rock, we know this. The Pharisees probably didn't, but we know this. Jesus is the only person who's qualified. And yet, rather than hold her under the law, rather than condemn her by the letter of the law, Jesus says, neither do I condemn you under the law. But he does add this, and we can't miss this. He still tells her, go. And from now on, do not sin anymore. She broke the law. It could have cost her her life. Jesus says, go live under the law. Go follow out. Go carry on that law. This is still an important thing. And here's the thing. While I'm fairly confident, I think I can go out on another limb here and be confident in the fact that this woman, from that moment till the time that she died, she probably committed another sin or two. Right? I don't know about you. I know I have broken the law before Christ and after. So it's likely understood that this woman probably still committed a sin or two. However, I can't help but believe her life was completely changed after this moment. That nothing about her life was ever the same. I don't think that she left this encounter with Jesus and went back to her lover. I don't think that she left this moment and went right back into what she was doing ahead of time. She probably had a mess to clean up at home. She's still going to have to face some consequences between her and her husband. But I doubt very sincerely that she went right back into that relationship. I think that her life from this moment on was changed because Jesus, in this moment, prioritized her life over the judgment of the law. He prioritized her as a person over her violation. He prioritized his love for her over the letter of the law. Jesus showcased in this narrative that his priority, we'll go ahead and say it, his top priority is love. He could have stand and accused her. He could have stand and condemned her. But in this moment, his love for her was far more important. That this woman, in spite of what she had done, in spite of the ways that she broke the law of God, in spite of the ways that she was sinning against her own Lord, he still prioritized loving her. Understand, this woman was not changed by the law. I don't know many people's lives that are changed by the law. Right? There's speeding laws. You still speed? It's 35 by my house. I don't remember the last time I went 35 by my house. No one's life is ever really changed by the law. What changed this woman's life, what shifted everything for her, was the love that she was shown. This law was written long before this woman was ever born. This woman was not the first, and let's be real, she wasn't the last to ever break this particular law. Her life was not changed by the law. It was changed by the love that Jesus showed her. She didn't deserve it. She didn't earn it, certainly. She gave him every reason to not. But he was still able to prioritize love over the letter of the law. If we're going to be people who become more like Jesus, if you and I are going to become more like him, if this discipleship relationship, our end result, our end goal is to try to be more like Jesus, that means that we need to prioritize love. Because the reality is people's hearts aren't changed by law. They're changed by love. Jesus was even asked a question at one point in time. He was actually asked a question about the law. And in his explanation, he demonstrates us the importance of prioritizing love. We read it in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40. It says, "Teacher, which command in the law is greatest?" He said to him, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Don't miss this part. All of the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. All. 3 letters, 1 syllable, big word. All of the law depends on love. Every single command that's written throughout Scripture, if we took the most concise version that we have of the law, if we took the 10 commandments, Jesus says all 10 of those boil down to 2. It's kind of interesting when you actually go back and you look at those 10 commandments and you can see, okay, yeah, this one definitely would mean that I love God. This one would definitely mean that I love people. All of the law boils down and it depends on love. Without love, the law doesn't hold a whole lot of weight, does it? Now, before you go off saying that Brandon must think the law doesn't matter, that this is, who cares, all this stuff, and you get mad and start throwing things at me, understand the law still does very much matter. It is still important, but I think that Jesus shows us a new perspective on the law. See, the law still informs you and I about what is a sin. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 7, verse 7, that I would not know what a sin is were it not for the law. He goes on to say, the law tells us not to covet. How would I know what coveting is without the law? The law still matters. But Jesus showcases that there is a higher priority, and that priority is through love. Jesus gives us a different perspective on looking at the law. He shows us in this particular narrative that the law is not simply an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts. If we look at the law through the filter of God's love for us, it is a set of guidelines in a relationship based in love. The law was written through the love of God. It showcases the boundaries of a relationship with Him. And as we've already talked about, when we are in a relationship with someone that we care about, we will shift our own priorities to be more in line with theirs. When there are boundaries in a relationship, you and I, if we care about that relationship, we will do everything we can to stay within those boundaries. I love my wife. I don't want to do anything to offend her or hurt her. And she's got her own little boundaries for me. I stay within those boundaries as best I can. Not because I don't want to upset her, but because I love her. I don't want to hurt her. If we love God, if we love Jesus, if we want to be more like Him, if we want to follow after Him, it means we probably need to adapt His boundaries and His ideas and His priorities in order to become more like Him because we care about Him. The law was not written simply so we don't have any fun. Of course, if you think you can't have fun within the law, that's a problem too. The law was written because God is trying to dictate to us, these are my boundaries. But even if we violate those, even if we break those, Jesus showcases to us that God still loves us. We can still have that relationship with him. We cannot forget to love when we tell people about the law of God. Far too often the church has been known for what we're against rather than who we're for. I don't believe that we are genuinely going to bring about change in the world by screaming, by yelling at it what they should or should not be doing. Right? Has anybody ever yelling at you changed your opinion on something? Yeah, I didn't think so. Typically, whenever somebody screams at me about what I'm doing, maybe it's because this is who I am and I'm a little bit of a spiteful person, I just do it more. I do it louder. We're not going to change people's hearts by screaming at them the law. We change people when we love them. When we showcase the love of Jesus to them, when we see them come underneath that love and then discover the law for themselves. To see them adjust their priorities and their adjustments in order to better follow God themselves. The law matters, but only when it's in love. If we want to see the world around us change, it happens when you and I love first. Jesus said in John 15, verse 12, and we're going to close with it today, he said, "This is my command." We can almost read that, "This is my law." Love one another as I have loved you.